Going live. Okay, we're on the air live. Okay, today I have Professor Robert Schmidt, but he's actually gone to the dark side. He was a former UCSD faculty who's now become a capitalist, but a capitalist in a good sense, right? So Bob is off, and I'm going to let him tell you all about SG Biofuels, but Bob is over there trying to make these things real. And so we have him today, and I'm going to let him introduce himself and tell you a little bit about where we are with Jatropha fuels and where they are with their fantastic breeding program. And then we're going to answer some of your questions and talk about other stuff.
Yeah, I was with UCSD for nearly 25 years. Was consulting for SG Biofuels beginning back in 2007. We're here local in San Diego, so it made it very convenient. And then in 2012, I decided to accept their offer as chief scientist to help drive their breeding and molecular biology program. And so I stepped down from UCSD and still connected, as you can see here. I still get over here to the campus, and I'm happy to participate. The project was going great. That's the reason I decided to leave UCSD. We've been in the process now for the last 7 years trying to make the genetic improvements in this crop that would really bring it to the marketplace as something economically viable. And SGB has made incredible progress in those 7 years. Part of it is this foundation of germplasm that we collected, which I talked about in the lecture, and our ability to make hybrids. Hybrids are so much more productive than races. And then the short generation time of this plant has really lent itself to the genetic improvements, because that's how fast you can make improvements in that crop by making crosses to bring in new traits or to inbreed the parental lines to get better uniformity. So today, the results from our plantation research in Guatemala has exceeded our expectations this past year with our most latest hybrids that were direct seeded in August of 2013. We pushed the yield all the way through the dry season there with irrigation, and we exceeded our expectation, which was about 5 to 5.5 metric tons, and we actually got a little over 7 metric tons of dry seed and about 38% oil content. So that equates to about, in terms of acres, probably about 300 gallons per acre, which is definitely economical.
And so the plan, I know Jatropha are perennials and they'll go on for many, many years, but these you only planted in August of 13, so they're only a year old.
So this is the other thing we've been able to accomplish, is to shorten the maturation time. Typical for Jatropha that was planted back at the turn of this century was about 4 or 5 years to reach full maturity and full production, which at that time was, full production was, in credible reports, was about a metric ton and a half, as opposed to what we can get in 1 year with our best performing hybrid, which is 7 metric tons. So it's an amazing able to do with this plant. And again, I credit it to this wealth of germplasm that we had to work with, and the work of the breeders, and using our molecular genomics program to really help drive that breeding effort. So it's been, I think, on a small scale, a great success of what can be done if you have the right tools in place to initiate a program of crop improvement.
So are you going to get better yields next year and the year after? What's the...
So we've obviously been focusing on yield. That has been the primary focus, because we knew if we couldn't get the yields there, nothing else really mattered. I think the yields can still go higher. If you look back at literature that came out around 2007, 2008, projections were that Jatropha probably had the potential to reach about 7.5 metric tons of dry seed, with less conservative assumptions about where the photosynthate goes. We had estimated that it probably 10 metric tons was possible, and now I'm pretty convinced that we'll be able to hit that in the near future through a combination of two things: continued improvement in the genetics, much better understanding of the agronomic practices that can help drive those yields, and then also I think we're going to see improvement just because we're selecting now not just for yield, but for the capacity of these hybrids to withstand higher density planting without sacrificing the harvest index that we've achieved. Just like what has happened with corn. A lot of the improvements in maize productivity over the last 20 years has really come from selections for the ability of corn to grow under higher density. So more plants per hectare without sacrificing the yield.
Yeah.
And we're just experimenting that this year. We'll see how that turns out, but I think it's going to really help drive the economics even more positive for Jatropha.
Okay, so before we jump on to questions, though, the economics, that brings up a really important point, which is this is directly tied to the price of fuel, to the price of oil.
Yeah.
Right? I hope all of our students have been paying attention to the price of oil. At the end of July, it was almost $100 a barrel. A little more than that for Brent, tiny bit under that for West Texas, WTI as they call it, West Texas Intermediate. It was about $97, $98 a barrel. It hit $81 a barrel.
I saw it at 83, and I didn't know it went down to 81.
It hit $81 a barrel 2 days ago. It's back to about $83 a barrel today. This is a really interesting dynamic. It's interesting for a couple of reasons. One, there's been this, general, I don't know if belief is the right word, but certainly it has been in the popular press that because of the dramatic increase in the United States in production due to fracking over the last 5 years, which is almost 3 million barrels a day increase, that was going to drive the price of oil down to $40 a barrel. We are going to have this unprecedented increase in production from fracking. This is going to expand to the rest of the world. And, happy days, we're going to be here again. And that didn't happen, right, for the longest time. And now what did happen was the price came under some pressure at $97 a barrel. And what really happened was everyone expected the Saudis to cut back. So we're at about 92 million barrels of oil per day. So 3 million barrels of fracking oil isn't that big of a difference. That's 4%, right? And in general, in the past, what has happened when that new oil comes online, because in oil you balance supply and demand very closely, what people expected was the Saudis, who produce about 11 million barrels per day, would cut back. They would actually cut back to about 9 million barrels per day. So people thought, oh, the Saudis will cut back even more because they've always been sort of the swing supplier and kept prices balanced. And amazingly enough, as it drifted down to about 95, then 94, $93 a barrel, the Saudis came out 3 weeks ago and said, you know what? We are not cutting production. And in fact, we will sell oil to everybody on the planet who wants it at $89 a barrel. So the Saudis announced that, and the next day, oil was $89 a barrel worldwide, and then it drifted down below that. I'm not a conspiracy theory kind of guy, but one of the things that's been talked about for many months is the reason we had this dramatic increase in fracking was not because of this great new fracking technology. It was because at $100 a barrel, you can afford to deploy that very expensive technology to pull out oil that we've known has been underground for, we've known those, the Bakken and the Eagle Ford shale for 70 years, okay? So what happened is oil got to $100 a barrel, we did all this fracking, and some people had said, you know what, the Saudis are gonna get tired of this, and they're gonna cut the price because at $80 a barrel, those frackers are gonna be in serious trouble. So as much as it's kind of bad for my friend Bob here, and actually for my other friends over at Sapphire Energy, that oil is $80 a barrel right now, that is not going to last very long. Going to last about a year, maybe 2 at the most.
Yeah, you figure when the economy in Europe gets on its feet, here in the U.S., it's just getting traction. When China starts moving at full speed, the demand for the energy is going to accelerate tremendously, and the price is going to come back up with that again. So.
Yeah, one of the things we've talked about in here is over the last 2 years, worldwide, we've spent $2.4 trillion with a T dollars looking for new oil, and we discovered less than about 24 billion barrels. In that same time, we burned through 56 billion barrels. So we replaced less than half. And yet, amazingly enough, I was reading an article today on how, oh, look, peak oil wasn't right. We got it wrong. I know we got peak oil dead right. It was in 2007, and it's on its way down. But that gets back to our question, which is, I think one of the things that everybody in renewable fuels has to do is, be a little sober right now and take a breath and say, okay, oil's down to $80 a barrel. People think that it's going to go lower. It could, who knows, but not for long. And it's going to come right back up. And when it comes right back up, and people start demanding more of it, which they are going to do because the developing world is going to demand more of it, China and India, in the next couple of years, then the price will be back up. But that gets back to that was a long-winded way to get to a question, which is, so how long? It's okay, you guys made these great dramatic increases. That's 100% increase in production in the last couple of years. Sounds like you might get that again in 2 more years. How close are you guys to sort of economic, viability in any market worldwide? And what's right now the game plan for sort of launching these things?
Yeah, of course, that depends, on the country. What's the price of labor? What's the price of land? It all plays into the entire economics. And the other thing, we and I think other people in the industry have survived this downturn in the interest in Jatropha have come to realize is that you need to monetize more than just the oil. I mean, the oil was the primary focus, but to make it really profitable for the farmer, there's a lot of biomass that gets produced. It's a perennial fruit tree. In our models, we prune it twice a year, so there's a lot of biomass that is produced from that, which can be utilized in a simple fashion just by burning it in these industrial furnaces to drive steam power or electricity generation. More downstream is maybe deconvoluting that into the sugars and lignin and use that sugar in a more high value form than just burning it. But right now, that biomass adds to the economics. The other thing which has got us excited at SGB is there are companies working on new processing methods for extracting the oil, which in the process, you end up eliminating these toxins, the 4-ball esters that are present in the seed cake, which now you have the option of burning that for fuel or using it as fertilizer to go back in the field. But the real economic value for that is as animal feed, because there's a very high quality protein that is produced in the Jatropha. It's got an essential amino acid balance, very similar to soy. And what we can actually produce per acre or per hectare is actually greater than soy currently with our best hybrids right now. Right now we can't use it as animal feed unless you go through a more elaborate process of detoxifying it, which is energy intensive, and so that decreases the greenhouse gas reductions.
But don't in fact you have to do that with soy? Don't they have these like if you eat raw soybeans, it has some anti-feeding protein?
Well, for a lot of beans and stuff, you have these lectins which cause indigestibility, and also with soy there are even some complex carbohydrates which end up being sort of anti-nutritional, if you will, depending on what animals you feed them to. So I mean, all seed crops
protect themselves.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we try to select against those features through the crop improvement domestication programs, and I think for Jatropha, there's a genetic way we could go about this, which we are pursuing internally, but I think it makes more sense if there's a processing method that could eliminate the 4-ball esters from that seed cake and make the proteins that are available as animal feed. Would be great for the grower.
And you guys work on that? You're working on the process development as well?
We're in discussions with a couple different companies who have a couple very different types of processing methods, but I think both look very promising at the pilot stage, and we're trying to help them move those technologies forward, because I think that's actually better than a genetic method where you might be able to inactivate the gene that's responsible for those 4-ball esters. That's fine. You can make a non-toxic or a 4-ball ester-free hybrid out there, but then you run into the issues of how do you keep that separate from other Jatropha that has the toxins in it, and there's a lot more supervision that has to be put in place regarding the machinery to make sure there's no contaminating Jatropha that would be toxic into the supply of non-toxic material. So if there's a downstream, a processing method, then everybody's material can go in and come out 4-ball ester free, which would be great.
Yeah. Okay, so that sounds to me like a couple of years.
Yeah, I think it is. It's on the horizon. There's pilots out there now, and we're trying to tweak the efficiencies of these. And I think it's all going to come together here in about the next 1.5 to 2 years.
All right, good. When we'll be able to get stock and
yeah,
that's what people always ask me. I don't know. Privately held company. Okay.
I would just love to see this crop become a reality. I've invested 7 years of my life, basically, and I saw the promise of it early on. I got enticed by it, as have a number of other people in SGB and around the world that have gotten excited. There's a lot of features of Jatropha that attracted everybody to it, and the reason it failed early on is because nobody was willing to put in the time and the money to really try to build a better plant, and that's what we've had to do.
Okay, so that's a perfect segue into our questions here. So, question number 1. Is there a concern that Jatropha will become a monoculture and become susceptible to a single catastrophic pest or disease? It kind of did on the first go-around, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Well, there clearly, some of the hype that you saw and maybe have read when you were investigating on the internet was that, Jatropha is toxic, but it has no pests. It is tolerant to all sorts of different fungal and bacterial pathogens. And like with any plant, there are fungi and bacteria which can become a problem with those plants. So far, anything we've seen, we've been able to address it with commercially available fungicides or pesticides in small amounts. It really depends on where you're growing it and how you're growing it. And we've come to recognize the fact that, at least in where we're going it in Guatemala now, where we have the most information from all of our trialing and plantation research, is that if you can work with the natural balance, there are natural predators that take care of a number of the insect problems. And if you don't get carried away with putting on these pesticides, which inadvertently kill the beneficials, you can use a lot less to maintain good productivity. You just have to monitor your fields on a regular basis and hit those areas where you have an outbreak without disturbing the rest of the normal balance out there. And this has really helped us tremendously. Getting back to, will you end up with some sort of pathogen or viral pest when you get into monoculture? And this happens with a lot of crops. I think the key to that is keeping ahead of it with identifying new genetics that is resistant. We do it all the time with corn, with soy. There are pests out there that sometimes you don't see until you get out 10,000 hectares or 10,000 acres worth of a crop. And then you see pathogens and insect pests that you never experienced before. So yes, we will see those challenges. With our model, with our hybrids, is not to go out with a single hybrid. The idea is to have a suite of hybrids for a grower, some that will mature early, some mature mid-season, some mature late. And that way it staggers the harvesting, so it allows you to utilize the equipment or personnel you need to bring in that harvest. So we'll have different genetics all the time in the field. So it won't be one single hybrid that's out there. There'll be a spectrum of hybrids. So hopefully when we see a problem emerge with one of these genetics, we'll be able to have some resistance in the background that we can bring to the marketplace shortly thereafter.
Okay, here's a good one where Bob and I get to duke it out now. And this says, how does the oil yield of Jatropha compare with non-terrestrial options like algae in terms of volume and land needed for growth? Go ahead and answer, Bob, and then I'm going to say something.
No, I mean, at a very high level, there's room for every one of technologies, depending on where you want to grow it. On a per acre basis or per hectare basis, there's no doubt about it. Algae is the promise. It is. That's what has captivated so much investments into algae, because long term, it offers a great solution. And it may not be applicable to every location and every environment. Just like Jatropha is not going to be applicable for every agroclimatic condition that you find. And what you want to do is go to those areas where that crop is going to be the best answer for meeting our future energy needs.
Yeah. So just to give you a couple of numbers. So Bob says he's up to 300 gallons per acre per year, on his way to 600 in the next year, and probably up to 1,200 in the next 4 or 5 years. And those are fantastic yields. That's about half of what algae is on a per acre basis. But there is one really enormous difference. And that's that Bob gets his by walking out with seeds and pushing them into the ground. And that ground doesn't have to be flat. And that ground does not have to be prepared in much, different form than a basic farm is. So maybe $100 an acre, depending upon where you are to prepare that land. You want to put in algae, that's at least $5,000 an acre to go build that stuff. And right now it's more like $8,000 or $10,000 an acre. So there's algae has an enormous advantage on productivity in terms of photosynthetic yield, because once you get into water, you can increase the concentration of CO2 much higher. And CO2, believe it or not, is rate limiting synthesis, so you have an enormous advantage there. But that comes with an enormous burden of infrastructure that you have to put into it, okay? Where I think, and the reason I really love these guys in SG Biofuels, the reason I really love these guys is there is an enormous opportunity for Jatropha to go to small farm holders, right? I know for these guys really to be successful, they're talking about, can we have a 10,000 acre, can we have a 100,000 acre plantation? And that's great, you know, for answering energy needs, you know, maybe globally, and that's great for big corporations to come in and build. But the opportunity that I still see here is that you've got 20 acres in Guatemala or El Salvador or West Africa or India that you're going to farm on, and you dedicate 2 of those acres or 4 of those acres to growing Jatropha. And from that Jatropha, you get enough diesel that you can run a tractor on the other 18. And that is, in those people's lives, that is a game changer. You've given them the ability to run a tractor, to be much more productive on their 20 acres. And believe it or not, that's what 2 billion people on the planet rely on for their food source. It's these small farmers that are, you know, producing enough for their family and maybe a few other people. It's not the big bucks that you get from the giant corporation things, but this has got enormous potential. You are never going to do that with algae, okay? The systems are simply not built. People ask me all the time, hey, can I put a small one of these in my backyard? You can do that if you want to make a nutraceutical and eat it. You cannot do that if you want to get your car.
And I think the other real promise of the algal biofuels is the potential for some of these algae, which are naturally adapted to salt or saline conditions, to be able to grow them on basically ocean water, diluted ocean water. That's a huge plus going forward.
Yeah. Yep.
So.
Okay, so there you have it. I love Jatropha, and fortunately Bob likes algae, and that's why I still invite him over for these things. Okay, we're gonna jump around and take a couple of different questions. This one's a little off topic of Jatropha, but it was still in this week's class, so we'll talk about it. And this comes from Bruce White, and he says, I find it hard to see cellulose to ethanol in large scale. Well, Bob, the Department of Energy wants to disagree with you. They spent $4 billion on that. $4 billion with a B, okay? Anyway, hauling wheat straw to a processor would be costly. Yes, it is. Could it, however, be adapted for small applications at individual farms or for mobile units trucked between sites? Anyone doing this? So let me say a couple of things about cellulosic ethanol. So there are 2 pilot plants that are going to come online in the next month. One of them from Poet, one of them from Abengoa. These are out in the middle of America where they get wheat straw for pretty cheap. Right now, those plants are hauling that wheat straw to the site. You're right, there is a limitation because it's low energy density and it's kind of expensive to haul big volumes of low energy dense stuff around. That they have to be with just in a few miles of the site, but there are a couple places that pull this off. Their number one expense is still the enzymes to degrade that cellulose down into sugars. You actually cannot buy them commercially. If you buy them commercially, they're about $35 a kilogram, and that completely throws your economics off. You're up at $6 or $7 a gallon for ethanol. But if you produce them yourself on site, for less than $5 a kilogram. And so both of those places are going to produce their own enzymes on site, use that to degrade it. They're not big facilities. They're about 50 million gallons per year, but big enough to be a demonstration facility. So those are going to come online this year, and we're going to see how they go. A lot of people remain skeptical because what I always tell people is, look, there's a reason we make fences and houses out of wood. And that's because a couple 100 million years of evolution developed those things not to be easily degraded from cellulose into primary sugars. That's why we don't make houses out of spaghetti. So, you know, spaghetti starch is easily degraded. Same thing, it's a polymer of a sugar, but that one easily gets degraded, and but we eat that one, right? And we don't eat the other ones because they're not easily degraded, not in your stomach, not in anything. So there are some enormous challenges, both in the chemistry of that and then in the logistics of it. But we got a couple things, and we're out there and we're going to see how it goes. The one thing that always shocks me about this whole thing is one of the things that Bob mentioned earlier, which is, you know, once you have dry cellulose, you can burn that and make electricity, right? It's actually burns pretty well. In fact, if you blend cellulose in with coal up to 20%, you can get the coal to burn more efficiently because you bring a lot more oxygen in with the cellulose. So it actually gets the whole process. And that's called renewable power. And why we don't do more of that, I don't know. But I think in other places they do. That's actually what gets sugarcane ethanol to work in Brazil, is the fact that you can burn the bagasse, which is the leftover cellulose, for the very energy intense part of distilling off the ethanol. I don't know. Bob, you want to say something like that?
I think you know, if and when it becomes efficient to extract those sugars and then convert those to ethanol fuel, at least then you have a way to kind of store it. And it's difficult. I think you're right. Short term, just take the straw, take that cellulosic material and combust it. That is the quickest and easiest way to get the energy out of that and harness it as electricity. The problem is you can't store that in any real way, which you could with an ethanol-derived fuel. You can do other things with it. So it has a higher value. What I still find difficult is that, and there are companies out there that are doing this and then taking those sugars and feeding them to organisms that can convert out and spit out farnesene or these hydrocarbons that can be used to fly jet airplanes, which is exciting. But what's the energy loss every time you go through a conversion process?
75%.
It's huge
in general.
And so then what is if you do a real life cycle analysis, what is the real net energy gain when you do that? I don't know if it's really been looked at closely. So that's the one thing I think eventually it could get efficient enough. But I sort of sit in your camp. I think right now probably the best way is just combustion and good, efficient industrial furnaces to capture that energy as electricity.
But as Bob also points out, we have other ways to get electricity, whether it's wind or solar. Those work really well. You guys all know I got my new electric car. It's working great. Putting photovoltaics on my house this month. And so we have other ways to do that. What we don't have is liquid transportation fuels. That's what makes Jatropha that high energy dense liquid fuel that you can store for use anytime you want. Okay, well that brings up, here's another question that's kind of related to that. Is there any possibility to create a car engine that can fully operate with ethanol, for example, using supercharger to increase the energy output to compensate the disadvantage of low energy density? Okay, so it turns out that ethanol, although it's low energy density, burns really well and has a very octane rating. So that's why the Indy cars and NASCAR run with a higher percent ethanol in them. You see the little ads on the side, running on ethanol. They're not doing that for the environment. They're doing that because that's higher octane. So you can actually get an engine which runs on 35% ethanol and 70% or 66%, whatever, of hydrocarbons, and put that and supercharge that engine to be the most efficient engine out there. So there are ones that are made, and those are the Indy cars. That's 35%. Those are something ridiculous. So those are super efficient, super high energy engines, and they work really well. The problem with those is that we don't have an infrastructure for 35% ethanol. So, and by that I mean, we sell about 19 million cars, 18 million cars a year in the United States, and a car lasts for 20 years. So we've got all these cars that can't run on that, and you don't want to have two sets of infrastructure. They sort of pulled this off in Brazil, where they have flex vehicles, ones that can either run on high ethanol or low, but it takes a really long time to get that into the mix. So if we can get cellulosic ethanol to go, Then we can get beyond what's called this blend wall, which is about 10% ethanol. That's a maximum you can go in a traditional car now. So if you have a Ford or a Chevy, you know, that isn't a flex vehicle, 10% ethanol is as high as you can go. But we could make these new ones, but they're not worthwhile making those right now when we're using corn ethanol, because we've kind of capped corn ethanol at, you know, 13.9 billion gallons per year, because that's 40% of our crop. We can't use more of that. So if we get cellulosic ethanol to work, and if we can start to scale up, then yeah, there are opportunities to bring in different engines. They can work, but remember, $12 trillion of infrastructure in this country is going to have to be replaced. That means that fuel is going to be expensive for the next 20 years, because when you buy that fuel, you are going to pay to replace that. To a Jatropha question, this says, assuming Jatropha could be grown in the warmer climates of the U.S., would you say it has the highest biodiesel potential compared with other terrestrial feedstocks?
Yeah, well, the first part of that is still an if, right? Jatropha is not tolerant of freezing temperatures, so it's not really adapted for temperate climates. That may change. It's always a matter of time.
Wait a minute. I thought you were already...
We are in the process of trying to make improvements.
That means it's going to change. Bob just hasn't got around to it yet.
So, SGB is experimenting with more cold tolerant varieties that come from higher elevation selections that we've made. And we're also experimenting with higher density plantings in faster maturation times that might allow us to come in then to the southern parts of the United States, plant this in April and be out of there by October with enough of a yield to make it economical, both from the biomass and from what that can be obtained from the seeds. So I think it's in the horizon. It's just not clear, how much more time we'll need to do that. Right now, the focus has been really on driving the perennial model and getting the yields to where we need them to be. But I think it will happen. If you have a good genetic foundation, all sorts of things can happen, right? I mean, maize grows up in Canada where it didn't 20 years ago.
Yeah, but that's because of climate change. because
a combination
of breeding.
Genetics that matures faster. And typically the yields are not as great when you have quicker flowering times and shorter maturation, because you just don't have as much plant material there to capture the photosynthate. But I think it is very possible.
And then the second half of that question, is it the highest biodiesel potential compared with other terrestrial feedstocks? And I think on that one, it crushes them, right?
Based on our full year yields that we're getting in Guatemala, yeah, I mean, we would be much more competitive than soy. Now, when we condense that down to growing it in a 6-month time frame like soy, we'll have to see what the trade-off is. I think we will exceed soy at that point.
Okay. And there are still lots of places in the United States that are plenty warm enough to grow, right? You could grow this in Florida and southern Texas.
Oh, you can grow it. Yeah, I mean, you can grow it in Hawaii. You can grow it in parts of Florida.
Okay.
It's just it's a combination of temperature and the northern latitudes, which provide an impediment to the really peak yields that you can expect when you get further down south, where it's naturally adapted.
Okay. Okay, here's an easy one. I'll just fire this one off really quickly. It says, can we collect used cooking oil to produce biodiesel? Absolutely, yes, we can. How hard is it to convert? It's very easy to convert. And is anybody do commercially? Yes, they are. In California, so pretty much used cooking oil is now, I think, in the United States, universally being collected. It used to be used as pig food because you could spray it on, it's good high calories, right? Humans won't eat it anymore after you've cooked in it for a little while. It might be a little stinky, but pigs love it. And so it used to be sprayed on pig food, but at a very low value. I think 10 or 12 cents a pound was my recollection. Obviously, fuel is up around 60 or 70 cents a pound, so that's a higher value. So now in California and many other places, it's collected and done that. One of my favorite places here in San Diego is called Buster Biofuels. And Buster is a guy, and he drives around and collects it from all the restaurants and has a processing facility up in Escondido. And I'm not sure what they produce. I think it was up to a couple thousand gallons a week that they were making and selling. and he was expanding the last time I talked to him, which was a couple months ago. So absolutely commercial. It's done now. We also collect not just used cooking oil, but animal fat, and that also gets converted into biodiesel. Okay, let's go back to one now that's more directly with Jatropha, and says, what about water requirements for, and I'll let Bob answer on the Jatropha, and then I'll say something on the algae.
Yeah, and again, water requirements are complicated, right? Because it depends on the soil types you have. It depends on not just the annual rainfall in a particular region, but over what period of time does that annual amount of rainfall get distributed? Because that has a big impacts on the productivity of the plant. And then, as I mentioned earlier, to get these yields that we've achieved in Guatemala, driving it through the dry season with drip irrigation. We use drip irrigation that, we end up, I would say, probably about equivalent about 2 acre-feet to 3 acre-feet of water, which is what you typically need for a crop of corn, soy. So it's in that same ballpark in order to get that productivity during that dry season. During the rainy season, there's adequate water that falls on there. If you have, as we do in our plantation research, we have supplemental irrigation to make sure that we don't have an extended period of lacking rain during the rainy season or drought that could impact our ability to keep making advancements there. But again, I think it really depends on the agroclimatic conditions in the different parts of the world where you may go with this to really be able to answer that accurately. And in terms of how that compares with algae, turn it over to the algae expert here. Yeah.
So again, that completely depends upon where you grow it. I think a lot of people are shocked to find out that what's called pan evaporation. That means if you just have a flat lake out there, that pan evaporation is quite often less than transpiration from a field full of corn. And the reason for that is when you have a field full of corn that's up 4 or 5 feet, every one of those leaves is transpiring water. So they're pumping water out of the ground to stay cool. Which is a little different than evaporation. Evaporation, a flat surface, water's coming off the top. So what does it depend upon? It depends upon what's the humidity of the area that you're in, what's the temperature, what's the wind. So all of these things, and that can be anywhere from as high as 36 inches per year, like corn, down to as low as 9 or 10 if you're in the really humid places, like if you're in Florida or if you're in Texas. Believe it or not, evaporation is just less because when the water's, when humidity's up around 95%, not that much water's coming off of it. But that's not the big advantage that we think in algae. All of the algae companies that are thinking about going to large scale, so not the ones that are thinking small scale, high value products, those ones we still think about freshwater. But all of the ones where we think about large scale, we immediately go to saltwater or brackish water. There are lots of algae that grow in the ocean. And then once you get into saltwater, then water is not nearly the issue it is with fresh water. And in fact, with the polar ice caps melting, we're going to soon have a lot more ocean water, so we'll have an excess of that in no time at all.
Yeah, and the trialing that we do with Jatropha right now with the clients in India and Guatemala and Brazil, we usually do both. We have drip irrigation and then normal rain fed. And that way the grower can also see, okay, what's the real economics? What's the benefit of having that irrigation in place? What's the cost of that? But how much more yield do you get versus relying on the rain fed? So it'll be a decision that the grower is going to make depending on the economics.
Okay, here's one we can knock off pretty quick. It comes from Raphael, and he said, we did not see data for carbon emissions of biofuels. How do they fare compared to fossil fuels? So the way you calculate that, Rafi, is something called a life cycle assessment or a life cycle analysis. We will talk about that in one of the later lectures. In California, the rules are for you to be a renewable fuel or what's called a low carbon fuel, you have to have at least a 40% reduction in CO2 emissions compared to fossil fuel. So that means you have to be at 60% or less of those. If you're not that, then you don't get to be counted as a renewable fuel. A life cycle assessment is kind of a tricky thing because that counts, what part of the carbon in that fuel do you attribute, do you have to count when you burn it? And why do I say that? That's because if somebody asked the question earlier about cooking oil, well, if you produced that oil to be used in cooking, then as part of a life cycle assessment, you would normally attribute all of the CO2 from that oil to the cooking process. So that gets counted against your French fries and your chicken and whatever else you cooked in it. And then rather than throw it away, if you go and recycle it, you don't have to count that CO2. So they do really well on their life cycle assessment. They're considered very low carbon fuels. The same can be true about algae. It's about a 70% reduction in CO2 because you're pulling CO2 out of the air. My bet is Jatropha is going to be up in about that same ballpark. Corn ethanol, not so good. It depends a lot on what energy you use to do the distillation to get the ethanol, the low quantity ethanol out of the, after you fermented it, to get it to the very high percent, 98 or 99% ethanol that you use to burn. That takes a lot of energy. If you get that energy from burning a fossil fuel, you have to count all that carbon against you. That's why some life cycle analysis of corn ethanol say that it's actually no better than gasoline. In fact, it's the same carbon footprint. So again, depends completely on the biofuel. And in California, that's a very carefully measured thing. Everything gets counted against you, including something called indirect land use. So that means if I take an acre of corn and harvest that and use that for biofuel, and that causes somebody else in a different part of the world to plant a new acre of corn so they can sell that acre of corn that I used to sell for chicken feed, now they're going to sell it for chicken feed, I actually get taxed. That carbon emission from that 1 acre of indirect land use gets counted against me. That makes it very difficult for corn ethanol to be considered a low carbon fuel. And here in California, we don't, but we do consider Jatropha, we do consider waste cooking oil, we do consider algae, we do consider cellulosic ethanol. All of those guys come through just fine.
Yeah, there's a number of published reports that have looked at the life cycle analysis of Jatropha. And typically it's in terms of reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, it's in that 60 to 75% range. And those were based on per acre yields, per hectare yields that were considerably lower than what SGB has been able to do today. So I think it'll be even better.
That's right. They get better as the yields go up.
Yep, exactly. And also as you learn how to really work with this crop and understand, what are the agronomic inputs that you really need to drive those yields and not to exceed those. So.
Yeah, and then if they're allowed, if they can accomplish the detoxification of the seed cake and then use that protein to feed cattle, then they'll get an additional benefit because that will displace distiller's grain or soy, which would normally be fed to those cows. And then you get to count the CO2 that would have been emitted from growing that soybean. So it can go even much, much lower than it is today. But that's process development, and that's why life cycle assessments are kind of a complex thing. Okay, here's a good one, and I know Bob can answer this because I've heard him talk about it before. As Jatropha comes from the Greek words etros and troph, that mean it was the food which heals something. Okay, do you know if there are any uses in ancient years as a healing thing? Bob, tell us what it is.
So in Guatemala, when we travel around making our collections, which we do some every year, we go to a lot of very rural communities, and there's an amazing amount of folk medicine around Jatropha. People have Jatropha growing in their backyards or in their pastures because they use it medicinally as a inexpensive antiseptic to treat insect bites or scratches. There's a variety of different potential medicinal uses for this crop, and that's part of the reason why it was spread around the globe back 300 years ago by the Portuguese. I mean, they realized you could squeeze the seeds, get oil, make a simple soap, make a simple candle, but it also has medicinal qualities associated with it. And I don't think anybody has really looked at it in terms of what pharmaceuticals, what active ingredients could be there that would be worthwhile. And typically when there's a wild plant and there's local culture that has grown up around that and have various uses for those, typically there is something there. But we haven't looked at it as a company, but there is a lot of local lore about the uses of Jatropha in many different ways for medicinal purposes.
Yeah, and certainly the name Jatropha is derived from that.
Exactly.
It's because it was a medicinal plant.
Yep.
So you're
Absolutely right. Yep.
You're dead right. I can't pronounce your name. Epimena. Oh, that's bad. Epimenodomus.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Okay, we got a couple more questions here. Let's see. Here's another one that says, and I know Bob has an answer for this one. This comes from Mitchell, and he says, do the Jatropha fruit have to be harvested by hand? And have you come across any strains that drop their fruit when they are ready, or do they have to be picked or shaken off? And I know Bob's working on these things.
Yeah, and all the Jatropha originally was harvested by hand. And in our plantation models right now, we currently have sort of a semi-automated process. So people are still cutting the fruit bunches off with mechanized carts that are brought behind to collect those and then move them out of the field. We're working on mechanization. There is a number, you can go online and you can find examples of harvesters for Jatropha fruits. We've looked at them and have not been overly impressed with those. And I think a big impediment to mechanizing Jatropha was the fact that it was so variable. There wasn't any real uniformity. And with hybrids now, and with our more inbred parental lines that are giving us very good uniformity, it has opened up the window now to begin to mechanize. And so we mechanize the seeding now. We direct seed. We can mechanize the pruning. And we're trying to optimize the harvesting. And again, in some parts of the world, there's no interest even in that mechanization process because there's so much labor that governments would like to have employed. And so, hand harvesting is fine. And again, it depends on where you are. Other parts of the world, man, if it's not mechanized, there just isn't a labor force to really make it work. And so we are trying to push the mechanized harvesting of it. And again, we have in our collection of germplasm, there are types which are very abscission prone. The fruit bunches will fall off shortly after they ripen. There's other ones which will stay attached. And depending on what kind of a harvesting mechanism you want to kind of imagine, either one could be of value. And so we just haven't really settled on what is the best one at this point. But I think it will be completely mechanized in the near future.
And I noticed you said that you prune trees. So is it that the fruit only comes on the new branches? So it's not like I don't know, like my apricot and peach tree
exactly.
where the fruit comes
It's
from.
not like a temperate fruit tree where you get a flush. It's first part of the spring, you get this flush of flowers, and then you have all this fruit that ripens, more or less in a 2 or 3 week period. With Jatrophas, with many subtropical plants, they grow vegetatively, and then the terminal bud on those branches initiates an inflorescence, that cluster of flowers. And once those get pollinated, it de-represses another meristem there that grows out, and then that will terminate and set up a flower. So you have what we call different flushes or floors of flowers. You get this first one, second one, and the third one, and those are the most productive. And then the fourth one, a little bit less worth it if the conditions are right to maintain that. So you have these sort of semi-synchronous formations along the branches of these different floors of fruit production, which requires, to harvest all 4 of those, you need really 4 major passes through your field to get all that fruit off.
And that's the expensive part.
That is the expensive part. We're working on ways to think, okay, can you let those first 2 floors develop, which is probably 60% of the total yield, and then come in and basically do a prune and a harvest all in one mechanism, and then let it grow back and get another two flushes of fruit and repeat that. And so that's something else which we're investigating.
Okay, here's one which is a little tricky, but I think we can say something about it. What is the role of molecular biologists in genetic domestication compared with genetic engineers? So maybe let me rephrase that question to make it a little simpler. So when you're domesticating a crop, as you are in Jatropha, what are the roles of the breeders and the genetic engineers and the molecular biologist in that process? Maybe answer that question.
And it's a combination now because we have so much more insights into how to advance crops using tools of molecular biology. In our case, in Jatropha, it helped us organize our germplasm into related genetic groups, which has really helped the breeders in selecting which parental lines to cross to make the most productive hybrids. There's the ability to identify molecular markers that are associated with certain traits, and then that makes it a little bit easier, especially if it's a trait that appears only in the adult plant. You can now screen that at the seedling level and eliminate having to put out a lot of those plants, so it makes the whole process more efficient. And so those are currently, those are modern practices in agriculture, and it's genetic modification, but it's not genetic engineering in the sense that you're moving genes from one organism to another, or shuffling the genes in a fashion from driving the expression of a gene under a different promoter, even if it's from the same species. But it's all, as you guys know, all of our crops today are genetically modified. They've gone through selections. Human intervention has changed the form of plants. We use artificial selection. That's what we impose on plants to force them into a mold, if you will, that is beneficial for us as humans, not necessarily beneficial for that plant when it was in the wild, which is what it is, the process of natural selection.
Yep, I guess the only thing I would add to that is there's a role for all of those.
Exactly.
Obviously, with molecular biology, you can very quickly now tell what the genotype is of an organism. And I know that SG Biofuels does this microgenotyping, where they take a little punch from the leaves and then very quickly. And what they're looking for in that are markers or gene sequences that they know correspond with a trait that they want to keep. And this way they don't have to grow the plant all the way up for 2 years and have it set seed. They can, in a seedling stage, they can already know, okay, I got that by traditional breeding and traditional crossing, I got that right gene into this strain, and it's likely to have the trait I want. Still got to grow it up and prove it. So molecular biologist helps there. Genetic engineering is a little more precise. Maybe I have a resistance gene and I just want to move that one in, and it's extremely difficult for me to get that with one of my cultivars that I have now, one of the strains I have now. I'm going to pull that from a different species. That's obviously used in corn and soybean. I don't know that SG has used it yet in Jatropha, but at some point they will. And then obviously traditional breeding, and selection. Bob shows pictures, and I'm sure they were in the talk this time, of their plantations with all sorts of different. They have little squat ones and big, tall, thin ones, and some that are purple colored leaves and wide. And so that enormous genetic variation, that's not brought about by genetic engineering, and that's not brought about by molecular biology per se. That's just the variation that was in the crop, and then breeding, and they can see those variations, but molecular biologists and molecular genetics helps a lot to pick those out.
Yeah, basically we focused on that natural variation which exists there. If you can source enough of it, and then you can use that to your advantage, because nature itself has pushed the crop, depending on where it's growing, to adapt to all sorts of different environmental constraints, and you can tap into that natural variation if you have a good foundation of it.
Okay, we have time for one last question, and we're going to go back to a really general one. This came in from Mitch, and we started the whole office hour today, so we'll end on it too. And he says, I'm curious as to why corn prices have fallen so much. Even a month ago, when West Texas Intermediate was almost $15 a barrel more, corn was $3.45, and it continued to fall to $3.23. Now sharply increased over the last week to $3.52. Still not close to $6. Okay, so what Mitch is talking about is there is a very tight correlation between the price of energy and the price of food, right? That as the price of oil goes up, the price of food is going to go up. There's a tight correlation between that, but it's still a complex interaction directly between energy and a crop like corn. What is that complex interaction? It's a couple things. One, when you're a farmer, you got to pay more for fuel to drive your tractor. You got to pay more for fertilizer. You got to pay more for irrigation, because that's an energy cost to pump that stuff. Okay? All of those things absolutely impact the price of corn. But as a farmer, you don't get to add up everything you spent on that, corn crop and then say, it cost me $3 a bushel, therefore I'm selling it for $4. Unfortunately, that's not the way it works. It's completely supply and demand. Many farmers produce a whole lot of corn. That's the supply side. and then a whole bunch of people who want to buy corn, that's the demand side, they negotiate with each other and come up with a price. Some year farmers make a good price, some year money. The reason the price is down right now, down to 323 a little while ago, was not because the price of oil was up. It was because so much of our corn crop was diverted over the last several years into corn ethanol that people planted much more of it. They actually planted more than 100 million acres last year. And the last couple of years, we had a bad drought, all right? So it was kind of energy prices on top of drought that got corn up to $6 a bushel. It actually briefly hit almost $8 a bushel 2 years ago. We had a great growing season this year. We had record yields that came in September and October. The final tally isn't in yet. When I saw it a few weeks ago, it was 14.5 billion bushels, all-time record for the United States. So it's that all-time record that it's not quite, that stuff, by the way, is not quite on the market yet. That's just what the harvest is and what farmers are reporting. But what happens is people who are bidding on corn are saying, oh, but they've got these huge yields that came in, and even though they're not quite all in the silos yet for me to buy, they're going to be there. Supply is enormous. I'm saying demand isn't going to be so high this year, so it gets bid down. So you can't look for week-to-week prices and think that you're going to see a straight correlation between petroleum dropped $15, the price of corn should have dropped $15. Over the years, it does that, okay? But not in the short term. And it doesn't, unfortunately for farmers, indirectly, which means that the price of oil goes up this year. They've already committed to planting their crop. They're going to go ahead and harvest anyway. That supply is going to be in there. Now, if they only get 323 a bushel this year, next year they're going to plant less. They're going to say, you know what? Oil was, my gasoline was $4 a gallon for my tractor, and my fertilizer was X, and I didn't make all that much money last year on corn, so I'm going to plant less. So I would not be surprised if next year we see planting of corn in the United States drop back to that sort of historical 90 to 92, 94 million acres, not the 100 million acres that it was this year. Bob, any comment? You're an old corn guy. Come on.
Yeah, no, I think it's absolutely right. The economics are going to impact the volume that gets produced. And if there's a glut and farmers don't feel like they're making enough money with the current prices, then probably the extra hectares that went into corn will then go into soy, next year, or whatever other crop might have been displaced by the added plantings of corn.
About 5 million acres actually came out of grassland.
Is that right?
Yeah. So hopefully they'll go back into that. Those things can actually recover pretty quick if people stop planting and let them go back to native grasses. But about 5 million was pulled out this year.
Yeah.
Okay, well, that's it for today. We'd like to thank Bob for coming by today.
My pleasure. Yeah, and thanks for the questions, you guys. Enjoyed being here and enjoyed seeing the kind of questions you guys had.
Okay, and I will see you guys all next week, and go back and watch the rest of your videos.
All right, we'll see you. Thanks.